1. e4 immediately claims central space and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, setting the stage for active piece development and often leading to open tactical games. This move immediately establishes the Sicilian defense, a dynamic and unbalanced opening that challenges white's central control and promises active counterplay for black. This move, knight to f3, initiates the mainline open Sicilian defense, preparing to challenge black's central pawn and control key squares while developing a piece actively. This move establishes the classical variation of the Sicilian defense, aiming to control the d5 square and prepare for central pawn breaks. This move, 3. d4, immediately challenges black's pawn center, aiming to open lines and create dynamic play characteristic of the open Sicilian, forcing black to make a key decision about their central pawn structure. This move, exchanging the c-pawn for the d-pawn, opens the c-file and leads into the main lines of the Sicilian defense, creating an imbalanced pawn structure where white has a central pawn majority and black has a queenside pawn majority. This move initiates the main line of the open Sicilian, where white aims for rapid development and central control in exchange for black's semi-open c-file. This move, developing the knight to f6, is the standard response in the classical variation of the Sicilian defense, challenging white's central pawn and preparing to castle. This move continues to develop white's pieces rapidly and maintains pressure in the center, preparing for further pawn advances or a kingside attack depending on black's response. This move, the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense, prepares to control the b5 square and often supports a later b5 pawn advance to gain queenside space. Developing the bishop to g5 immediately pins the knight on f6 to the queen, a common tactic in this variation of the Sicilian defense, aiming to create pressure and potentially disrupt black's coordination. This move prepares to challenge white's central pawn and develop the bishop, aiming for a solid pawn structure and active piece play in this variation of the Sicilian defense. This move initiates the classical variation of the Scheveningen Sicilian, aiming to build a strong pawn center and potentially launch a kingside attack. This move prepares to castle kingside, while also developing a key piece and reinforcing the d5 square which white's knight currently attacks. This move directly challenges black's central pawn structure and prepares to connect the rooks. After further development, this move prepares to defend the d6 pawn, supports a potential e5 pawn break, and connects the rooks while also allowing the queen to participate in the central fight. White castles queenside, embracing the aggressive intent of the Yugoslav attack variation of the Sicilian defense, preparing to launch a pawn storm against black's kingside. This move develops the knight and prepares to support the e6 pawn, often leading to a closed Sicilian or a variation of the Najdorf Sicilian. This aggressive pawn thrust on f5 aims to destabilize black's kingside and potentially open lines for white's pieces, but it weakens the e5 square and requires careful follow-up to avoid creating structural liabilities. This move decisively contests the center, challenging white's pawn chain and opening the e-file for black's forces. This knight maneuver aims to redeploy to a more active central square like c5 or d4, and also prepares to challenge black's d6 pawn indirectly. This move initiates a typical Sicilian Najdorf pawn storm on the queenside, aiming to gain space and potentially undermine white's kingside attack. This move prepares to support the pawn push b4, preventing black's queenside counterplay and potentially expanding white's own space. This move develops the bishop to a useful diagonal, preparing to potentially challenge white's knight on c3 and support a queenside expansion. This move initiates a bold kingside pawn storm, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed nature of black's king and potentially create attacking chances on the h-file. This move establishes control over the open c-file, a crucial strategic element in this Sicilian dragon variation, preparing to challenge white's central control and potentially launch a queenside attack. Developing the bishop to d3 actively supports the central pawn push of e5 and prepares to castle queenside, aligning with white's aggressive kingside pawn storm strategy. This move aims to prevent white's pawn storm and prepare for kingside counterplay by stopping the g4 advance and potentially creating a space advantage on the kingside. The king's move to b1 is a standard prophylactic maneuver in this Sicilian Najdorf variation, creating a safe haven from potential threats along the now open c-file and offering an escape route from any checks. This move redirects the knight to a more active square, eyeing squares like c4 and preparing for potential pawn breaks on the queenside. This move repositions the knight to c4, preparing to contest black's active bishop on b7 and potentially exert pressure on the queenside pawn structure. This move actively challenges white's knight on d2, aiming to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances by exploiting the d3 bishop's position. White removes black's active bishop, preventing potential pressure on the queenside and preparing to exploit the weakened light squares around black's king. This recapture on e7 activates the queen to a central square, preparing to contest the d-file and potentially challenge white's kingside pawn structure. This knight repositioning is part of white's plan to reinforce the kingside defense and prepare for a potential counterplay on the queenside, while also aiming to free up the d2 square for another piece. This move sacrifices a pawn to open the c-file for the rook, aiming to disrupt white's kingside castling and create attacking chances along the open file. This recapture opens the b-file for black's rook and removes a strong knight but also strengthens white's pawn structure and opens the c-file for white's own rook. This move aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and create dynamic play by challenging the d4 pawn, potentially opening lines for black's pieces. This move relocates the queen to a more active central square, preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially support a pawn advance or counterattack. Black finally castles kingside, securing their monarch and preparing to activate their pieces further within the complex Sicilian Najdorf structure that has unfolded. This move sacrifices the bishop to gain a tempo by attacking the queen and simultaneously disrupts black's pawn structure, opening lines for white's pieces. Capturing on b5 with the pawn opens up the a-file for your rook and offers a temporary pawn to disrupt white's coordination, but it also creates a potential weakness on c6 and allows white to challenge the center with the d-pawn. The exchange of pieces leaves white with a dangerous passed pawn on the queenside, now further supported by the queen's capture of the pawn on b5. This move, nc4, is a brilliant tactical blow that seizes the initiative by forking white's queen and bishop on d3, forcing a favorable exchange and creating significant counterplay. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to exploit the weak c4 square and pressure black's pawn structure while preparing potential queenside counterplay. This move forces a queen exchange, simplifying the position and leading to an endgame where white's extra pawn on the queenside is a significant structural weakness black can target. This pawn capture on c3 exchanges material and leads to an endgame where white's central pawn Majority on the queenside is a key positional advantage, potentially creating a strong passed pawn with careful play. This move sacrifices a pawn to activate the knight and attack white's king, aiming to create complications in the endgame after the queen exchange. This move prepares to develop the knight to a more active square, potentially targeting the advanced d5 pawn and supporting a queenside pawn advance. This move, knight to a3 check, exploits the misplaced white knight on g3 by attacking it and simultaneously targeting the undefended rook on a1, creating immediate tactical complications for white. This move repositions the king to a more active square, allowing it to escape the immediate threats and potentially participate in the endgame, while also guarding the vulnerable c2 pawn. The knight's fork on the king and rook forces white to exchange material, simplifying the position and allowing black to maintain active piece play in the endgame. This move repositions the king to a safer square, anticipating black's knight checks and preparing to support the vulnerable queenside pawns. This move repositions the knight to a powerful central outpost, aiming to control key squares and prepare for further activity on the queenside or in the center. The move Road 2 aims to centralize the rook after the exchange on c3, offering defense to the d2 pawn and preparing to contest the open c-file. The capture of the knight on h1 is a material sacrifice that does not yield sufficient compensation, as black fails to achieve any significant positional advantage and allows white to develop a strong attack with their remaining pieces. This knight recapture, while regaining material, centralizes the white knight and opens the h-file for potential king-side activity, but also neglects the defense of the now vulnerable d-pawn. This move aims to regain the sacrificed pawn on e4, but it allows black's rook on h1 to capture the knight, creating a significant material imbalance in black's favor. White is aiming to consolidate the material advantage and organize a defense for the king, but must be careful of black's active pieces. This move aims to recover the sacrificed pawn by activating the bishop, but it leaves the knight on f2 vulnerable to further attack and doesn't address white's dangerous passed pawn on the d-file. The king actively seeks safety on the queenside, aiming to connect with its remaining pawns and potentially offer defensive support. This is a decisive check that forces black's king to a more exposed position, and aims to exploit the current material advantage by maintaining pressure. The king bravely ventures into the center to escape the checks, aiming to find safety and potentially participate in the endgame. This check forces white's king to the a-file, preventing it from immediately escaping into the center and allowing black to consolidate the material advantage gained from the rook sacrifice. The king ventures into the center of the board, a bold but often necessary maneuver in simplified endgames to contest central squares and support advancing pawns. This check forces white's king to a precarious square, continuing black's fight for active piece play despite the material deficit. This move forces black's king back, potentially disrupting its defensive coordination and allowing white to consolidate its material advantage while maintaining pressure on the queenside. This knight check forces white to move their king, preventing its escape and setting up potential tactics after black's next move. The king's daring venture to d7 exposes it to further checks, but strategically aims to regroup by potentially supporting the knight on e3 or evading checks on the open c-file. This move sacrifices a knight to regain the queen, aiming to simplify the position and exploit black's scattered pawns. The capture of the rook with the king is a forced continuation that leads to a favorable material exchange, strategically simplifying into an endgame where white maintains a decisive material advantage. This move aims to regain the lost pawn by attacking white's exposed knight on c8, while also developing the bishop to a more active diagonal.